Having fled the Raven-ruled East, we pick up Ethan's story as he and Skink are crossing the Great Sea. We find both of them below decks, with the autopilot handling the bulk of the work. As he holds up Ashley's green jewel, Ethan can't help but ask if he did the right thing. For about a page, the pair go over the discussion that we saw in our last issue, that Ethan did what he thought was right, meaning warning his family about the upcoming invasion. But helping Ashley and the Underground was the right thing too. Things were so much simpler when it was just Heron versus Raven, Ethan complains. The ship suddenly jumps, jostling our boys, and the jewel pops out of Ethan's fingers. He scrambles over the wooden floor and snatches it up quickly, carefully tucking it away. Ethan and Skink then head for the stairs, worried about what that impact was. Skink says that it could be a northern gale, given their position. They are known to manifest suddenly. Ethan sure hopes not. He isn't much of a sailor to begin with. He was pretty sure that he could get them home on smooth seas, not through one of the wildest storms that Avalon can produce. As he makes it to the deck, lightning flashes, thunder rumbles, and jagged waves toss themselves onto the ship. Shouting just to be heard, Ethan says that it is a northerner. He turns, telling Skink that they need to turn into the waves. They'll never outrun it. Skink shouts that they need to lower the sails before it's torn off, or it pushes them over. They both race to their respective tasks, Ethan to the wheel, Skink to the ropes. His face lit by a glowing green hollow screen, Ethan shouts that storms like this aren't supposed to happen anymore. This one might even be as strong as the one that sunk Edvin's fleet 200 years ago. Skink shouts back that the sail is too full, he can't drop it. Ethan can't steer the ship either, and a wave washes over them both. The sail tears away. One of the hover wings that support the ships explodes. This causes the ship to tilt, and more water washes over it. As the water recedes, it pulls Skink down towards the ocean. Ethan leaps, grabbing his friend and sinking his fingers into the deck. Either that wood is dramatically weakened, or his sigil is giving him super strength as the wood splinters under Ethan's grip. The ship tilts even more, its deck rising until it is nearly vertical. The sigil glows through the murky water. Ethan says that if the ship can just hold together, then he sees it. A wave so large that it blots out the sky rises up and up and up. Multiple streaks of lightning dance in the clouds behind it, but they're barely visible. This tsunami is enormous. It's dark. It's unstoppable. The wave bends over, folding on itself, and it crashes down upon Ethan's ship. The entire craft is shoved underwater. For a moment, Ethan and Skink pop to the surface, just long enough to gasp for air, shout for each other, and then they're separated. They get pulled under again. Ethan is yanked down so quickly that his head collides with a shattered piece of the ship, and he's knocked out. As Ethan falls further into the murky depths, the only thing visible is his quietly glowing sigil. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 18.3, Scion. It's not your fault. In every story, there is a need for conflict. Conflict challenges a protagonist, creating dramatic tension and giving them a chance to grow, or fail, which can, in turn, lead to growth anyways. It's been said that there are three main types of conflict in writing: protagonist versus man, protagonist versus self, and protagonist versus nature. Before I get too deep into these, a quick disclaimer about them. If these names sound a bit clunky, it's because they are. Traditionally, these writing tropes are called man versus, using man as a stand-in for any kind of lead character, the genderless form of man. It could mean a man, a woman, a wolf, a fey spirit, a robot, an alien, whatever you want. It's just conceptual shorthand for the lead character in a story, which is why I have replaced it with the protagonist. Second, there is some debate about whether these three categories are the only categories or if there are more, or if some of these even count. Author Ayn Rand would argue that protagonist versus nature doesn't count because nature doesn't make decisions, it's not a character, it just is. However, as someone who grew up around nature, although I rarely came into conflict with it, I would argue that it should definitely count. You learn when you encounter nature, whether that's what plants to avoid, how to handle a wild animal, how to handle an injury in the wild. Even if you just get your feet wet when you're crossing a small stream, you might learn that you hate the feeling of having wet feet. And that annoyance can distract you when you're in the field and make you make a stupid decision because of it, and on and on and on. So, since that's my opinion, and this is my podcast, those are my 3 categories, and Ayn Rand can suck it. So far, Scion's story has largely focused on the versus man and versus self concepts. Every time that Ethan has fought with Braun or had an encounter with him, that is a versus man story. The bounty hunter that Ethan fought last episode, that would be a versus man story, despite the fact that the bounty hunter was a member of the lesser races. That type of story basically just boils down to the lead character coming into conflict with another singular person. This can be done verbally, like with an argument, or physically in a fight, or mentally as someone has to outsmart a hunter, something along those lines. Every time that Ethan has questioned whether or not he should help the lesser races, or save his family though, that is a versus self conflict. This type of conflict pits the protagonist against 2 different things that they want, forcing them to question their motives, goals, or methods. This should lead to character growth in a well-written story. And now that we have covered our opening scene for issue 5, we finally get to explore our 3rd category, protagonist versus nature. Now, nature can refer to any kind of natural antagonist. So it could be a bear defending its cub, or the freezing temperatures of Alaska, or finding food in a jungle, or in this case, battling a storm while at sea. In pop culture terms, you can see this kind of conflict in something like the movie Iron Will, or Tom Hanks' Castaway, or 128 Hours, or in TV shows like Survivor Man, Alone, or any of the other survivalist shows on the Discovery Channel. And on film, this kind of story really works well. The visual, moving nature of video can represent the temperature of a climate, the isolation of a location, the difficulty of the terrain. Audio effects can translate sounds like the buzzing of mosquitoes, the drone of constant rain, or the dead silence of the woods in winter. A good actor can show visually and communicate verbally how miserable they are, or how happy they are when they triumph. In a comic book, though, these effects are much harder to get across. All the creative team has is a single static image, just one moment in time, to get all of that information that I just described across to the audience. In this case, it's easy to miss things like the temperature of the air shifting as the storm rolls in, or the smell of salt water in the air, the constant thrashing of the waves against the hull of the ship, or the movement of the boat. We forget that when Ethan steps onto the deck, not only is he half blind thanks to the storm, but he has water in his eyes, he is drenched to the bone in seconds, he is very likely cold, and he is fighting to stand upright as the ship pitches. I will freely admit that this opening scene honestly doesn't do much for me. That said, I don't think that there are any changes that could really improve the scene either. Penciler Chueng, inker Hillsman II, and colorist Rodriguez's artwork is detailed here. Even the waves are carefully rendered to have form and weight, and waves are something that are kinda hard to draw in a way that gives them that kind of structure. Rodriguez sticks with blues during the moments that we're in the storm, but favors a dull red and warm browns when we're inside. This makes the interior of the ship feel warm and comfortable, starkly contrasting against what comes next with the wind and rain. Perhaps some 90s-era narration boxes could have layered in those more subtle notes that I'm missing, but honestly that's just not Ron Mars' style. And honestly that would have cluttered up these beautiful pages. And clearly, I hope that my descriptions show that with some imagination, you can fill that information in for yourself as well. But if you've never been in these conditions, that can be a little difficult to do. Story-wise, Mars once again brings up Ethan's tortured feelings about the underground and Skink's rather lazy response. Despite questioning himself, Ethan somehow feels more sure of himself here. He seems much more comfortable with his decision to go home. He knows both of the options were the right thing to do, and he chose to go home, but the underground isn't far from his thoughts, clearly. But it doesn't feel like he's conflicted over it. He isn't about to turn the ship around and return to the Raven Lands. No, he is going home, but maybe going home doesn't mean not helping the underground. It feels like a very subtle shift in Ethan's character is happening here, and again, I'm finding it hard to kind of get the change that I feel like comes across here, but I do think something changed in Ethan between last issue and this issue. Ethan refers to the Northern Gale as the same type of storm that downed Edvin's fleet, Edvin being his ancestor. We last heard Edvin's name back in issue 1, when Ethan was given his sword. Its design is based on the design of Edvin's blade. Context clues have told us that Edvin somehow helped to found the tournament, which has kept the peace between the two nations for 200 years, and Ethan was born on the anniversary of that event. We'll learn more about Edvin as the cross-gen universe continues on, but it is interesting to me that Ethan is basically walking backwards in Edvin's steps. Edvin went off to war, got caught in a storm, ended up on the Tournament Isle, and then brought peace to Avalon. Well, Ethan started off in a peaceful situation, fought at the Tournament Isle, got caught in a storm, and is bringing war back to Avalon. Life really is strange sometimes. Now, this was a nice place to stop for a bit of a breakdown, but Mars doesn't really have anything or anyone to cut to, from a writing technique perspective, in order to play up the dramatic tension of Ethan falling into the ocean and potentially drowning. Instead, we just stick with Ethan as he sinks into the sea. As the small panels close back in on him, we see a darkly skinned, webbed hand just barely appear in frame. Wobbly blue word balloons float nearby as these figures approach, talking to each other. "Stranger," one says. "Airman," says another. "In danger. Help, 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 help." One of them reaches out for Ethan, who gives a start when he sees them. Surrounding Ethan are 4 humanoid beings that look, to me, like dolphin people. They are all dark-skinned, a gray that is so dark that it's almost black where the light doesn't hit. They're totally hairless with smooth bodies. A small ridge runs along the center of their heads, but under the skin. They close in on Ethan, encouraging him to breathe. Which sure sounds like a threat to an air breather like myself, especially when you're underwater. But Mars doesn't play this scene suspensefully. Ethan reacts violently because he's surprised, not because these beings are actually threatening. One of them slides in as they encourage him to breathe, and they press a small, insect-looking device into Ethan's neck. A bubble of air swells out around Ethan's head, and he is surprised to find that he can breathe. They encourage them to follow him, and he asks how he can hear them. Their voices are like music. But Ethan stops as they reach their destination, too amazed to talk. Below them is a massive, sprawling, undersea city. Several large domes of glass and stone are connected by clusters of buildings and pathways. A yellow inner light glows beneath the glass, obscuring their interiors. Quietly, Ethan says that it's beautiful. "Yes," one of the merfolk replies. "Haven. Safe now. All safe." "What does that mean?" Ethan asks. That he is safe? Or... Ethan doesn't get to finish his question as his vision starts to go black. The nearest dolphin person looks at him, encouraging him to rest. As I said earlier, Mars doesn't really take a lot of time to build up the suspense here. We see Ethan falling into the darkness, his sigil still glowing, and my first thought upon rereading this is that the sigil is going to allow him to breathe underwater. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised that it doesn't. So far, the sigil has passively responded to Ethan's needs, giving him the strength to beat Brawn, healing his face, maybe enhancing his physical strength when saving Skink on the boat just now. so why not let him breathe underwater? But it doesn't, and Mars quickly reveals the dolphin people. And then they immediately set about helping Ethan, and this is a part of what bothers me about this issue. In a protagonist versus nature story, the protagonist is up against an implacable enemy, flooping nature, and that forces them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't in order to survive. And that is largely a new feature to Scion, as we didn't get any survival elements to Ethan and Skink's trip through the Raven Wilderness, which is a bit of a shame in my mind. Ethan is alone, behind enemy lines, clearly wearing Heron-styled clothing, and no one managed to see him? Did he get wilderness training as a prince of the Herons? How did he eat when they were in the woods? Where did he and Skink sleep? How did he navigate the landscape? We have no idea, and we aren't shown, and now here, Ethan has to survive the Great Sea. But it doesn't actually challenge him at all. He lucks the
no swearing
out and gets saved by flooping fish people, which wouldn't be bad if maybe he had reacted poorly and tried to fight them, drawing on his experience with the bounty hunter. Or maybe if he had to prove himself to the fish people somehow, earning their trust so that they would save him. Or maybe he goes to fight them, but his sword was lost in the storm, so he reaches for his belt and he pulls out the only thing that he has on him, the underground jewel. And then the fish people see it, and they're like, oh, you're with the underground, that's dope, and then they help him. There's really no conflict to this scene. It feels like Ethan was playing this game on easy mode, and it absolutely bothers me. This issue has always been my least favorite of the first 7 issues, but this is the first time that I'm actually exploring why it bothers me so much, and it's oddly cathartic. Visually, the scene is interesting for 2 reasons. The first is that we're out in the ocean, so it's not like there's a lot to draw underwater. We aren't close enough to see the sea floor, it's just water for the most part. So without Rodriguez's colors, Ethan would look like he's floating in a void. But Chueng makes Ethan and the fish people move and pose like they are being held in water, so it does feel like it. The fish people look fairly plain for genetically engineered creatures, but they do look like they belong underwater, so props for that. The undersea city, Haven, is honestly very pretty. It does bring to mind some of the visual imagery of the Gungan city from Star Wars Episode 1, which had come out just a year earlier, so it doesn't look new, but it does look good. I also like the coloring on the bubble around Ethan's head, that looks neat, and Dave Lanfear's lettering for the fish talk looks neat and watery. It doesn't make me think music as Ethan described it, it looks more like to me. It's pretty, but it's maybe not a great fit. I'm also a bit annoyed that Ethan doesn't give a
no swearing
fuck about where Skink is or if he's alive, like, way to prioritize, Your Highness. But I get it. You were about to die, you're breathing underwater, you got an undersea city in front of you, it's a lot to take in, and unfortunately your best friend in the entire world just slipped your mind. That's fine. A brilliant golden light pierces the darkness of Ethan's eyes. 2 glowing orange eyes appear before him, but as his mind clears and his vision sharpens, those eyes focus into the 2 orange pupils of Skink. He asks if Ethan's all right. Ethan pushes himself up with one arm, which digs into the damp sand below him. Waves lap against his legs. His clothes are torn, his shirt is nearly gone, he looks rough, but he is alive. And somehow his sword lies in the sand next to him. Yeah, he's fine, Skink. He reports what he saw underwater, guessing that the device that they attached to him must have also knocked him out. Could any of that been possible? He asks Skink. A whole city underwater? He looks out over the surf and sees 3 familiar heads just cresting the waves. Skink doesn't know about a city, but they must have saved him too. They owe them their lives. Suddenly, the 3 heads drop beneath the water, and they're gone. All right then, Ethan says, looking around. Where are we? He turns, and carved out of the stone ridge behind them is a
no swearing
massive stone heron. Rising in gleaming white stone behind it is the Heron Keep. You get one guess, Ethan. I'm home, Ethan mutters, finding his feet. I'm home! We then cut to Princess Elena as she rides her father's horse around the keep's grounds. A shouting voice barely catches her attention. It's strange. It almost sounds like... She turns and finds her brother running towards her. "Ethan!" She dismounts quickly, racing to her brother for a hug. The ravens told them that he escaped, and they've all feared the worst ever since. It is such a relief to see him, but that's not all. Their father, King Dane, has gathered everyone in the war chambers. Cut to the war chambers. The rest of the Heron family, meaning King Dane, Queen Mariella, and Princes Artor and Kai, are joined by a dozen generals, advisors, and various staff members. They all huddle over a large circular table which displays holographic maps of the area. Princess Elena throws the doors open, shouting for her parents, "Look what just washed up on the beach!" Artor laughs and smiles when he sees Ethan. What kind of bait brings in a catch like that? King Dane and Kai are shocked, while the Queen rushes in for a hug. Thank the ancestors that he's alive. Ethan returns the hug gladly. "Skink made sure of it, Mother." Carrying Ethan's sword, Skink adds that he promised to watch over him. He's kept his word. The Queen nods at him. They're in his debt. Ethan is hugged by his father next, then his brothers. They're all relieved that he's okay, but Ethan being home only confirms that he has escaped from the Ravens, and that they have their justification for war. Ethan recaps our past 4 issues, and his father believes his version of events, but the fact that he didn't intend to escape doesn't change the fact that he is here. The Ravens have been spoiling for a fight for years, and now they will have it, regardless of how. The Herons have been trying to prepare, obviously, he says, gesturing at the maps. Ethan now drops his news. He knows where the Ravens are going to land. He points at the map, highlighting a specific area. They're going to land here, at Point Corday. Excellent. With this information, they now have the element of surprise on their side, King Dane says. But Ethan has to ask, can't we do anything to stop this? Isn't there still time to save the peace? The Raven fleet has launched already, yes? Artor asks. And are they going to hit that northerner that you did? Upon hearing yes and no, respectively to those questions, Artor draws a dagger. So they're on their way and they won't be stopped. If they want a war, then they'll have one. Flipping the dagger in his hand, Artor drives it into the table, ruining a perfectly good hollow table. I hope King Dane chastised him for doing so. What a waste of a cool hollow table. The end of this issue is also a bit frustrating for me. I am glad to see Ethan home and in time to dress the invasion, and that he gets a warm welcome from his family. I love that Artor continues to be the friendly jokester, not just relieved to see Ethan, but also cracking wise about his arrival. No one else does that, so it is a nice subtle touch of character for him. But this scene also largely repeats information that we already know. I can't even say that Mars is getting a potentially new reader up to speed on current events, because we have the story thus far page at the front of the book, so you don't need that bit. The only thing of note that happens other than Ethan arriving home is him informing them of the landing point. We know that the war is coming, this scene just makes it official, so it ends up lacking some emotional oomph. It's not like I feared for Ethan's safety in this issue, or thought that he would forget the landing point before he made it home. There's just no stakes to any of this. I'm also a bit annoyed that the fishfolk not only saved Ethan and Skink, which I get, that's fine, but they also saved Ethan's sword, and nothing else from the ship. They have no idea if Ethan had a sword with him when he went down. In fact, he left it in the hold of the ship earlier. So, why would they bother searching for the sword? Or bother taking the time to return it? And if they went to the trouble of returning the sword, then why wouldn't they bother returning anything else from the ship? That beach should be littered with debris, but nope. Ethan has the sword because from a plot perspective he needs to have a sword. It's lazy writing, and this bothers the crap out of me. This is also the second time that Skink's orange eyes have been specifically focused on. The first time being when he encouraged Ethan to sleep at the end of issue 2. So, Skink can make Ethan sleep and wake up What a superpower for the world's least interesting member of the lesser races. I have to point out, because it seems fairly obvious, that the glowing eyes that we see here look a lot like the orange eyes that we saw back at the beginning of issue 1, the eyes of the Creator and the Mentor. So perhaps Skink has something to do with all of that nonsense. Well, unfortunately, my least favorite issue of Scion remains my least favorite issue. But that's okay, because it's over, and we are ready to move on. Issue 4 opens slowly, with a bright sun rising behind a grassy hill. Stringy clouds streak through the blue skies above. A lone white rabbit sits on the hill, and it flees at the approach of horses. 4 of them crest the hilltop, and upon them are 4 riders. These are the Scions of the Heron Dynasty, meaning Princes Artor, Kai, Ethan, and Princess Elena, and they are dressed in chainmail, armor, and helms, with pristine white cloaks pinned to their shoulders. Artor stares ahead. It'll be soon now. Kai turns to Ethan, smiling confidently. Not soon enough, huh? Artor maintains his hard expression, a sign of his maturity compared to the younger Kai. Here they come. And suddenly a trio of red dragons fly over their heads. Thick leather straps circle their bodies, holding the harness that their riders are seated upon on their backs. Glowing fires gather in their toothy mouths. The camera suddenly moves above the dragon riders, showing us a field of raven tents below. Once in position, the dragons unleash their flames. The air explodes into fire before a charging rush of lesser races warriors, all of them clad in the blue and white colors of the Heron Dynasty, charge the field. They begin to cut down as many of the ravens as they can. All of this draws Prince Braun from his tent, geared up in beautiful red armor with yellow trim. He quickly realizes that the herons are upon them. They must have known about their invasion, and he draws his sword. He shouts, "To arms!" galvanizing his nearby troops. His red blade passes easily through armor and flesh, slicing an approaching warrior in half. Upon the hill, Artor studies the scene. Between the shock troops and the dragons, the camp will be in chaos. The Heron forces will move in and, catching the ravens between them, rout them but good. He then turns to Ethan. Can that mark on your arm do anything here? Ethan answers honestly. He has no idea. His eldest brother tells him to find out. This isn't going to be like the tournament arena. This will be hard metal armor versus sharp metal blades, and the fighting won't stop at first blood. Now he raises his sword. The troops will look to them this day. The Battle of Point Corday will go down gloriously in Heron history, if they can win it. He swings his sword down, kicks his horse, and they take off. The princes and princess charge forward, and hundreds of human Heron soldiers follow. For king and kingdom! If you couldn't guess, this issue is going to feature a lot of fighting. And not the one-on-one fighting where every character gets their own specific battle and they pull out amazing techniques like Dragon Ball Z or Naruto. This is going to be a lot of 2-page spread and crowd shots, so I'm probably going to end up moving pretty quickly through this issue. There are a few things to point out here at the beginning before we really get into it. First off, our lead character Ethan takes a bit of a backseat here at the beginning. We are largely focused on Artor, who pretty much leads this scene. Artor is the oldest child here, so it's very likely that he has more combat experience than his siblings, as well as training. As the firstborn son, he would be the next in line for the Heron throne, so he's much more inclined to be in a leadership position. I will also note that his jovial, joking nature is not on display here. Kai is the one who makes some "aren't you ready to kill some people, brah?" lines to Ethan, who largely stays silent and serious. Ethan is probably nervous. At the very least, he is taking this seriously, much like Artor is. That goes to show you how serious this battle is that Artor has assumed such a solemn disposition. We also see the Herons use their lesser races forces first, as shock troops. These troops are sent in first to start the killing, but it is of note because shock troops generally take a lot of deaths as well. After all, they're the first ones in. Their whole purpose is to surprise the enemy and start killing. But this makes them slightly more disposable, and so the Herons save their humans for the second wave. Also, the humans are all on horseback, they are cavalry troops, and between the stomping damage and maneuverability of the horses, they are much better off in combat. Ethan made a point of telling Ashley that the West treats their lesser races better than the East, but they are still sent out into combat first. And thirdly, I want to point out an artistic theme for this issue. After the initial opening page with the rabbit, every scene after this is a 2-page spread. Those 2-pagers aren't all a single image that takes 2 pages or a landscape shot, though. There are a number of smaller panels, sometimes running along the top or the bottom of the scene, or maybe down the sides. Sometimes you'll get a single big image that takes up the middle and right side of the page, with smaller panels framing it along the left and top. One of the sets is actually all vertical panels, each one capturing a small moment of a crowded battle scene. These pages are fantastically detailed, too. Everywhere you look, you can see an individual fight or story being played out. Obviously, our focus is going to stay on the Scions of the Heron and Raven households, but these aren't just faceless blobs of people in the background. They're individuals. These are people, and this is blood and grass and mud and fire. This is war, and it's going to get messy. The battle runs the length of the day. Clear blue skies become choked first with smoke, but then they turn black as the sun sets. Both sides fight on bravely, cutting down their opponents with glowing swords or blocking attacks with knives. Finally, though, things begin to close in. Prince Braun finds Prince Artur. He was hoping for that whelp, Ethan, but Artur will do nicely. Artur doesn't balk. He doesn't run. He just stares Braun down. The ravens will be routed today, and Braun will end it spitted on his blade. Then he charges, swinging at Braun's head. Braun blocks it, then deflects a stab, then counters another stab. Artur jumps, hoping to bring his sword down on Braun's head, but Braun quickly steps in. Just the tip of his blade opens Artur's side, and he ends up falling to his knees. Braun circles around behind him. He stabs his sword into the dirt and draws a knife. Then he kneels, pulling Artur's head up by his hair, before placing the edge of his blade against the heron's throat. "Don't you worry about Prince Ethan," Braun says with a smile. "I'll send him to join you shortly." Braun pulls the knife. Hot red blood splashes onto the battlefield in Braun's face. He stands up, his expression totally calm. That was not nearly as satisfying as he thought it would be. The shouting of Artur's name warns Braun of Ethan's approach. He grabs his sword and spins, barely blocking Ethan's downward strike. His sigil glows through even his chainmail, and orange energy crackles off of his blade. "You just signed your death warrant with my brother's blood!" "Oh, it won't be the last heron blood that I spill today," Braun promises, slashing back at Ethan. But he's powered by the sigil, and Ethan's next swing shatters Braun's sword. He falls back onto his butt. Ethan swings his sword around, pointing the tip down, preparing to plunge it into Braun. "I cut you in the arena," Ethan says. "My only regret is that I didn't kill you then." A blast of fire suddenly catches Ethan in the back, knocking him away. A black dragon lands near Braun. A young man reaches out for him, shouting that they've lost this fight. It's time to go. Braun tells Court that he won't leave. He must have his revenge. But Court remains firm. Either they leave now, or they won't leave at all. Come now, you'll have your revenge another day. Braun climbs aboard the dragon. By the time that Ethan has found his feet, the beast is already fading into the night sky. Ethan mutters, "After them," before his anger flares. "After them! Run down the ravens before they can escape!" He takes aim at a nearby raven soldier, who happens to be of the lesser races. "You'll never see the Ravenlands again," he shouts. The soldier, who is unarmed, shouts back, "Please!" But it isn't Ethan's hand that stays his blade. He turns, looking at who would stop him, and it's Ashley. "No," she says. "Not them." That's all that she says. The lesser race member ducks behind her, and without saying another word, she leaves. Ethan's anger is spent in confusion and exhaustion. He watches as she goes, quietly asking, "What is she doing here?" A small unit of Heron forces approach Ethan. They report that the day is won and their losses were minimal thanks to him. Then they kneel before him. The day is ours. Cheers go up around Ethan. "Hail Ethan! Victory! Hail the warrior prince!" But Ethan doesn't respond to any of it. He walks through the crowd and eventually finds Prince Kai and Princess Elena hugging. "They've seen?" he asks. "Yes," Kai says. Both of them have tears running down their face. There's nothing to be done." Elena reaches for Ethan, but he doesn't stop for comfort. He keeps walking towards Artor's body. "Ethan," she says, "it's not your fault." Ethan's sword drops from his hand. He falls to his knees, and he cradles the body of his brother. Unspoken, in my mind, is the fact that yes, it is Ethan's fault. Or at the very least, Ethan is going to be able to see it that way. Artor would never have faced Braun, the Ravens would never have attacked, if Ethan hadn't somehow scarred Braun in the tournament. No, he didn't intend it, but it happened all the same, and it kicked off this series of events. Just as Ethan beat himself up for being unable to help the Underground, this is another cross that he is going to end up carrying for a while. It's also the first time that the sigil is clearly linked to something terrible happening in Ethan's life. Everything up to this point was hard, yes, and unwanted, but it was also kind of manageable. That was all what you expect from a fantasy story in some way, yes? Adventure, travel, bounty hunters, sword fights, all the fun stuff. It was only a day or so ago that Ethan killed someone for the first time, and now here he is, having someone close to him killed. And none of it would have happened if it wasn't for the sigil. Skink told Ethan that it could be a blessing or a curse, and it sure looks pretty curse-like at this point. Given that CrossGen's books were written to be collected in a trade paperback format, they were also planned out for quite some time. Artor as a character was designed to look lovable, with his curling mustache and his slightly portly body and his jovial nature. We were meant to see the bond between the two of these brothers from the start, and Artor's jokes certainly made him stand out from the more serious Kai and the lacking a personality still Elena. Even if Artor isn't our main character, we got to see how much that he meant to Ethan. And now he's gone. Much like at the end of issue 4, when Ethan killed the bounty hunter, Mars doesn't frame this victory as a victory. The Herons won the day, sure, and we are told that they took minimal losses, and the Ravens were pushed from their shores. But Braun, the most vehemently hateful of the Ravens that we have met so far, is still alive, and Artor is not. This isn't a good day for Ethan. This is a terrible day, and from a narrative perspective, it's framed as such. We also touch upon the mystery of Ashley a little bit here. Whoever she is, she's important enough to the Ravens that she is outfitted with armor, which does match the general design of bronze, red plate with yellow trim, a big ol' raven crest buckling her sword belts together at her waist. But whatever her role here is, I am glad that her main focus is still on saving the lesser races. I only wonder how many of the Heron side she had to kill to do it. This issue pairs fairly nicely with issue 5, for as much as I didn't like it. Issue 5 opens with a storm, sure, but it quickly calms into a low-stakes adventure that sees Ethan safely home with his family, while issue 6 opens calmly and ramps into the ultimate stakes and a very sad ending. I spoke in a previous episode about Mars managing the ebb and flow of the narrative, knowing that it was all going to be collected at some point, and I have to give him a lot of credit for this here. This all ramped up nicely, but it also wasn't telegraphed. There was nothing that indicated that Artor was going to die, or that a character like Artor could or would die. Ethan's adventures up to this point have felt fairly safe. After all, he's our lead character. He can't die. But now, his family can die around him. And those are some pretty damning stakes. There's also some back matter to this issue that I want to point out before we go. I haven't been covering it because it isn't important to our overall narrative, but in the back pages of CrossGen comics, there have been several supplemental features. Since their first issues, this has largely consisted of a timeline of how CrossGen came to be, composed by founder Gina Villa. There have been suggestions for other good comics, ads for the rest of CrossGen's books, and letters from the earlier comics. There's also a small set of 2 pages called CrossGen Speculator in this issue, and it is literally just a collection of fan postings from the message boards. And this blew my mind. I had previously written into 1 comic book in my life, and amazingly, it got printed, but this was the year 2000. Who the floop wrote letters? We had email, instant messaging, message boards. This was how the fans communicated, at least with one another, if not with the companies. Seeing CrossGen acknowledge our existence in that way was amazing. And in the introduction, we're even told that some of the theories being thrown about were so close to correct that the CrossGen team felt that they had to honor it somehow. Now, not everything that was published was a correct theory, but it was still amazing to see that happen. Marvel never did anything like this. DC never did anything like this. I'm also fairly certain that seeing the Speculator page is what led to me actually signing up for the message boards, which I was probably lurking on up to that point but had never really engaged on. This is also a clever way of introducing someone who only bought Scion to the broader CrossGen universe, as the theories printed could apply to 1 book or all books. So maybe you're seeing something theorized about Skink in these pages, but then that connects it to the First, or Mystic, or maybe Sigil, and, maybe that means you check one of those books out. The best type of marketing is the marketing that doesn't feel like marketing, and this is a great example of that. There is also a single-page image of our bounty hunter character from issue 4, drawn by artist Andrea DeVito, inked by Don Hillsman II, and colored by Cesar Rodriguez. DeVito was a newcomer to CrossGen and the American comic market in general, so CrossGen was showing off their new talent and giving this character an official name. I seem to recall author Ron Mars actually posting on the message boards, or maybe in an interview, that he didn't even realize that the hunter didn't get named during issue 4. So this pinup image is the first time that the character is referenced by name, and that name is Exeter. If I remember correctly, Mars stated that the character was named for the ship HMS Exeter, although I can't remember why, nor can I find confirmation of that online. There have been several HMS Exeters, and most of them were sunk, so maybe Exeter's name echoes his fate, sunk at sea. Next time, the Heron dynasty mourns their loss, but Ethan wants more than peace for his brother. He wants revenge. And if that means traveling back to the Raven Lands, then by the ancestors, so be it. And having failed to accomplish the invasion, Prince Braun attempts to bring his own home to order by chasing down an escaped slave. But the underground protects the lesser races, and that means that Ashley isn't too far away. Join me next week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 18.4, Scion, Threats and Promises.
Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.